Welcome back to Booked, the podcast that helps you get booked on more podcasts. I am Spencer Carpenter with my co-host,
Amanda Foley.
And today we're going to talk about why some podcasts feel so easy to get booked on and others feel impossible. So I usually start off with you getting it from your PR experience and your input, but I will say off the bat that every podcast is different. Their systems are different. Their goals are different. Who they recently had on is different. Maybe what they're planning for the next 6 months is different. And so if you were to take nothing else from the episode, just understand that every podcast being its own thing and having its own criteria and avatar can determine whether or not you or someone, your client, whoever, gets booked on the podcast. Mm-hmm. I mean, what has been your experience with kind of breaking down doors on the more difficult ones, and which ones were really easy?
Yeah, I mean, what I'll say right off the bat is that I just said this yesterday on a call. Podcasts are so nuanced. So sometimes even if you're looking at podcasts that you would consider in the same category, mm-hmm. they're going to be looking for different things. Right. And so that's why, as we always kind of come back to, it's important to be really strategic in the work that we do, mm-hmm. because just because something looks right on the surface, if you actually dig a little bit deeper, you're going to find that they may have a slightly different listenership. It doesn't mean that they might not also have the client on,
right?
But what it means is you have to approach them a little bit differently. And so I say that to answer your question in that I have booked clients who you might look at on paper and say, oh, they don't have a huge following. They don't, on really big podcasts, mm-hmm. By paying attention to what those hosts are interested in the moment. So sometimes, and again, this is why I think what we do goes a little bit beyond some of the work that you see out there when people are helping people get on podcasts, because oftentimes, you know, the types of clients that I like to take, and I know you do this too with real estate and music and things like, you know, that you personally are interested in, you tend to also be interested in the content of the podcast that you're booking people on. And I think that's really important. That's an important distinction too, because it doesn't mean you have to like love everything that your clients are doing or be into it yourself, but it certainly helps, because one example I can give you is a client or a podcast where I follow their Substack. And this is the former host of the Goop podcast, who now has her own podcast that touches a little bit more deeply on like spiritual and like philosophical topics. And I happened to get her newsletter on a Wednesday because I'm interested in her content and her writing. And she was talking about money, which you wouldn't think is a topic that you might hear from that type of podcast. And I maybe would have never thought that the client that I work with, who's the spiritual investor who merges mindset and investing and, you know, building wealth, would qualify like or rise to the level that I would have pitched her to this person. But because I saw that newsletter, I was like, this is my opportunity.
It's a time to strike.
So exactly. So when you're paying attention, I think sometimes you can book clients that you may not think would rise to that level on huge podcasts. And then I have clients where I would think that they would be the perfect guest for a bigger podcast where it's tough, either because they've done something similar, or so I guess what I would say is that you can never swing too big if you put some strategy and thought behind it. But there's also a lot of value to the podcasts that we would call, like, I hate to even use the word small, like, or smaller, but they're mid-sized podcasts. But there's a tremendous amount of value there too, because I always look at it from a bigger PR point of view, in that when you are only doing the big ones, you look like you're just having an interview come out every few months.
Right.
And I know in a future episode, we're going to talk about some of those like in-person interviews and things like that too. So I won't go into that piece of it, but I also think that you seem like you're everywhere when you're doing all the podcasts if they're aligned. And so I don't know that it's necessarily that those podcasts are harder. I think it's just more competitive, and it requires more, a little more nuance in how you reach out to them.
Yeah. Well, you know, I've had some people tell me, like I remember one person in particular being like, hey, I don't have anything against like what you do. It's fun for me to find my guests. It's the part of having a podcast that I enjoy. I had someone this past week say, we do most of our own guest sourcing, so we're not accepting pitches right now. Which honestly, I don't entirely understand because it's like, well, just pretend.
Well, it raises the bar.
Pretend you just found my client. I don't know. See if he's a fit, then he should be a fit. But But
it raises their bar, right? In that they're only going to take the very select client that you propose. It just has to capture their attention.
Yeah, and it's also the host perspective on the industry your client in also is important. So, I work with a lot of real estate people. My real estate people come to me and they say, can you get me on shows that are outside the real estate ecosystem? It's great if I can hit all of those shows, but I've done a lot of them and I want to be the one voice talking about real estate on an entrepreneurship podcast. Well, it's really hit or miss whether or not the host of a business podcast views real estate as a business.
Right. Or if they're going to be interested in that as a topic.
Yes.
And it also, I'd say, closes your window in that they may only do one real estate show a year, if that, right?
Yes.
So you're again competing at a higher
and it might or maybe it's once a quarter, but if everyone they have on has 1,000 multifamily units and they're a syndicator to the host who doesn't know anything about real estate, they don't know how to make that conversation more nuanced. So those 4 people they have a year all say the same thing to them.
Right.
But it's worth having on because they have $1 billion in assets or something. And so that is that's why it can be difficult to break out of your specific niche and get in front of the audience you want, an audience that knows nothing about your service or topic, because the host might be like, well, why should we have you on to talk to our listeners?
Yeah, why do they
this?
care, right?
Yeah. So, and so that's on a pretty basic level. If you reach out to enough podcasts, you'll find people that just say it's not a fit. We're not looking for guests. We're already booked out 6 months. That's the other thing. It's just some of them are booked out pretty far.
Right.
Some of them are shifting to doing more solo episodes. I have no shortage of podcast hosts that tell me we have agents hitting us up every day. We don't really need more submissions, even if we wanted them. And then as you get into, some of the bigger shows, it is strictly, they can give you all the criteria you want, but the one thing they don't want to say, because it sounds superficial, is we just want someone with 1 million+ social following.
Which I think we know is often true. I just had this conversation with somebody yesterday too.
I just submitted someone to Lewis Howes that I think is perfect for the show. He's talking about trauma through, for men, that have gone through, sexual assault and that some type of thing, which, Lewis has talked about a little bit. So I thought there'd be a good fit. And the booker was like, yeah, it's not a fit right now. And when I pushed her on, well, what's the criteria you're looking for? She mentioned a few things. We look for.
That's nice that you actually got that feedback.
Yeah. And she did say, keep sending me people. But she said first is we want to make sure there's no red flags, no controversies. So I actually then did go do research on my guest to make sure that there wasn't something I didn't know about him. Nothing came up. They said we look for alignment in the conversation, which I felt there was alignment there. Maybe he doesn't want to talk about it with guests as much.
I was just going to say that could be it too. Maybe he only talks about it in solo episodes versus.
And that's just, there's no way for us to know that.
Right, because they may not disclose that piece.
Sure.
Too. Yeah.
And but in both correspondence I had with the producer, she mentioned we look for red flags and we look for social presence. How are they doing on other podcasts or other videos on YouTube? And many of them very specifically will say we're looking to see how they do on YouTube.
Because they're trying to grow their YouTube presence.
Yes. And so it's not necessarily even what big podcasts have they been on. It's can we find past interviews that are on YouTube
that drive viewers, or clicks or whatever.
And so, we're competing against stuff that has nothing to do with your merits,
and it's
your
different
criteria,
for every single show. Yeah.
Yep.
That's what I think. So what it comes back to me is how do you make sure the show is a fit? And then you always will have the best chance, right?
Yeah.
So it's all the factors that we have to just assume we're never going to be able to control.
Mm-hmm.
But if we make the connection and demonstrate the value for the host or the producer, whoever's looking at it, we're always going to have a chance of getting on the show.
Well, and something we talked about in our last episode, or one of our last episodes, was making sure you stay steady with interviews, even if you don't have something big going on. Mm-hmm. So the client I was just referring to, while I don't necessarily know if there would have been a ton of podcasts that had a ton of YouTube videos for Lewis's team to see, if he had been doing interviews throughout the last year, but he paused with me for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And
so they're not seeing anything recent.
Right. And now he has one podcast that he filmed last year that is talking about his, where he's opening up about his trauma, which is only new for him. He's putting out a book about it. Mm-hmm. And so I'm doing outreach right now to shows that have a large following, and they're asking, can we see samples of conversations?
And he's not talking about that.
Everything I have is from 2023, and it's not about that whatsoever. Is he open
to starting with some smaller shows and again, smaller, by smaller, I mean like mid-sized shows where...
I think he is if it's not brought by me who he hired to go get podcasts.
Yeah, and that's where, because again, like when people shift, we talked about this in a prior episode too, when people shift topics, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's why it's kind of important to know what you want to do when you go out there. And this is probably a little different because maybe he never knew he'd write a book about this, but if you can build that foundational base of interviews where you're talking about something, and then ladder on that, you have the leverage to then start having these bigger conversations.
He did just start his own podcast with his wife, and so I've been sharing that, but it's brand new, so it doesn't have a ton of views.
Has like a big following,
and they did actually just launch an actual TV show, but like in today's day and age, that some people don't even care about that.
Yeah.
So it's tough, but so, I mean, if you're ever wondering why you didn't get accepted onto a podcast or how, what hoops you have to jump through to get there, I mean, there's just, you never know what's on the other side.
There's no straight answer, right?
All you can do is position yourself the best and show that you can provide unique value proposition, a unique perspective, and show that you are qualified, not qualified, but that you understand who the audience is and that you fit with this message and
right, it's what they're looking for. Like, what is this audience looking for? And that's what the host ultimately wants to provide to the listeners.
Yeah. I would also say there are a few people that come to me and say, well, can you submit me to this show? And they know it's wishful thinking, but on my end, it's like, no, because I know you're not a fit, and I don't want it to reflect poorly on both of us.
Right.
Like, we don't know who
it's like
the
too
show
big of a
is.
stretch for you to try to create the connection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So being realistic about whether or not this is truly a fit for their audience, and even if it is, if it's what they want to focus on is important. So any last tips for listeners on, just how they can position themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think like you just nailed it all right there, demonstrating the value, connecting with the host, showing you understand the show, and that it's something that their listeners are going to want. And I would just say too, generally speaking, to kind of even start to finish where we started, there's no show too big or too small if you are a good fit and you can demonstrate that.
Yeah, that's very true. All right. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Booked, the podcast that gets you booked on more podcasts. I'm Spencer Carpenter. This is my co-host,
Amanda Foley.
And we'll catch you on the next episode.